I would. I thought it was to share my SCIM.
Where's your Kensington?
Somewhere outside of
It's right across, or directly across the park, or is this down?
It's not far at all.
No, we didn't need it. It's for recent traffic. We were
Okay, we have about 1 hour today, so I suggest we start. It's now 11:10. This is the first ever SEC event working group meeting. If you plan to be in Trill, that's one room over. I'm sure you've all seen this thing before. It's been going around. If you don't know what it means, there's 2 RFCs to explain this to you, or ask your favorite working group chair to explain it. On today's agenda, have agenda bashing, blue sheets are already going around, note well. Thank you, Ben, for being on the Jabber room. Thank you, Stefan, for taking notes. He's taking notes on Etherpad, so if anyone wants to chip in, go right ahead. We're going to have a very, very short introduction to this working group. As I said, first ever meeting. Then we're going to have presentations about risk, OpenID, connect, logout, and the proposed draft, and the proposed drafts. And if we have time, open mic. Somehow I doubt that. Any agenda bashing? Nope. Great. So, as I said, welcome to the first ever SEC event meeting. The first initiatives were going around even before Yokohama, but then a lot of them came up in the Yokohama meeting and the mailing list was formed. There was a sort of BOF at the SCIM session in IETF 95, that's Buenos Aires. There were some early drafts, some discussion of SCIM use cases. And finally, just under a month ago, we formed a working group and we have a charter. The next milestone on our charter is in February of 2017 to adopt drafts. So we're going to see going to get presentations about candidate drafts in this meeting. Current status. So we have a new working group. There is a set of deliverables, SET token format, profiling JOT, secure method for assured delivery using HTTP post, pub/sub management based on SCIM. As far as maturity is concerned, we're profiling mature standards. JWT and SCIM are considered mature. HTTP post is, well, both simple and very mature. The ID events in discussion for a year since November 2015. Similar standing to when we started adopting SCIM. And there are 2 proposed drafts. How many people in the room have actually read the drafts? Not including those who wrote them? Yeah. Okay. Just so that we're on the same page, how many people are familiar with JOT, JWT, RFC 7519? Okay, how many are familiar with SCIM? Okay, that's good enough. Okay, so on to the presentations, and if I remember correctly, the first one is risk. You get the slides up. Oh, there they are. Okay, stand in the pink box and Go ahead, tell me what to flip.
All right, so I'm going to present one of the use cases for security events. The one that we talk a lot about, we call it risk. Risk stands for risk and incident sharing and coordination. So basically, we want to share information about security events in order to prevent hijacked accounts events spreading from one party to another in a federated environment. That's the high-level use case. So what is the main problem we are trying to solve with risk? Accounts are interconnected. So federation, it's the obvious use case. We have identity providers, relying parties. And there are also accounts are connected implicitly through recovery options. The most obvious one is the email recovery option. If the email provider is compromised, it's probably, most people understand the use case, but other sites or relying parties that use that email will also be compromised through the password recovery flow or similar things. And it's not only email, phone number is another example, but the most common one, it's email that we talk about. And as I mentioned, if an account gets owned on one service, that quickly leads to that account being owned on all others or other services as well. So in federation, the main issue we are facing is the fact that relying party sessions, once the user is logged in, the sessions themselves are disconnected from what happens at the identity provider. So in risk, we discuss about two large group of events. One of them is account status changes. And here is a list of events that we have been discussing and looking at. From account being suspended because of suspected hijacking or abuse to explicitly suspended by the owner or by the provider. Once the account is recovered, then we have reactivated accounts. Again, there is distinction, and then accounts can be deleted. And there is distinction for many of these events between owner and provider, depending on what the situation is. Provider can be in a consumer case, and owner, it's in an enterprise case when the enterprise administrator explicitly does one of these actions on the account. And the other one is the reissued accounts. That's when an account is recycled and the same identifier is used for a different person. The other group of events are authentication changes. For example, password changes on the account. For some reason, if all the sessions at the identity provider are revoked for the user. Recovery options change, like email recovery or phone recovery change. Public identifier change. In some cases, users change their email address. And many relying parties use that email address as the main key, main identifier. Second factor added or removed, or grants, OAuth grants, or other kind of grants or tokens being revoked. So I'm trying to highlight, and in general for security events, in particular for risk, that the recipient of these events, it's always the user's application, whatever application means. So if it's, in federation case, it's based on OAuth 2, it's the target of the client or the relying party that the OAuth 2 grant was issued to. So that's the only recipient for events related to that user. And then when we talk about the implicit use case where the flow, it's based on a recovery information. Again, events are targeted only to the relying party that holds that recovery option or uses that recovery option. One of the tricky issues with risk events is how to it's around privacy. Basically, how do you keep the user? How do you notify the user in a way that a user understands what's happening? How are you transparent to the user? And the other one, should you, or how are you going to give some options to the user? The obvious point is that, okay, the user should have the option to opt out, but that's what an attacker would do in the first place. So it's a delicate situation. And the more delicate one is, how do you explain all these events that you are sharing to the user in a very meaningful way. So this is still a work in progress. I don't think we have a good solution for that, but that's still up. Just a few notes about an early implementation we have at Google. So we are started publishing two types of events, sessions revoked and tokens revoked. So sessions revoked happens when the user changes the password or explicitly logs out, for example. So we can notify third parties simply about the fact that Google closed all the sessions for the user, and the actual reason it's not shared. And tokens revoked, it's shared with third parties when the user explicitly terminates a relationship with one third party. So in this case, the event is shared only with the relevant third party in that case. And in near future, we are working on more abuse-related events when accounts are locked and recovered. And currently we are using, because we don't have a standard way yet for distribution, we are using a proprietary cloud PubSub, but we are going to move to the standard one as soon as we agree on an implementation. And also we are implementing only a publisher with plans to implement a subscriber as well. So in general, open issues around security events, particular about risk. As I mentioned, meaningful user experience. How do you keep the user in the loop? That's a very tricky thing to do. When you get to hijacking and abuse, to make the clear distinction between hijacking and abuse, should we make the distinction? So that's a lot of privacy is involved in this issue, and try to not to disclose too much details about the user. But in general, to make a clear distinction between what's hijacking, what's abuse, and what should be communicated to relying parties is still not decided. The implicit use case, it's when the recovery option is used. So the user doesn't have explicit relationship between the RP and the IDP. So we need to solve that use case. So we'll probably need some registration flow where the relying party explicitly makes an API call back to the IDP saying, hey, I have a new registration with this email address. I would like to receive security events for that. That's the high-level plan for that. We are working on standardizing distribution, and the sooner we get to a standard, the better, so we can start implementing. As usual, a big problem is getting critical mass, enough players, so we can start exchanging these messages. And while on many things we at a high level, we do have understanding how we're moving the standard, we still haven't talked about how to standardize each event in particular. What attributes to exchange, what URIs to use for events. It's a relatively easy problem, but still that's one step that it's one problem we haven't solved yet. And that's the last slide for me.
Any comments, questions? Okay, thank you. So next up is Mike Jones with OpenID Connect Logout. Let me just get the slides up. That's the one.
Hello, I'm Mike Jones from Microsoft, and I'm going to briefly overview a use case where the OpenID Connect working group decided to use the draft identity event format, or the security event format now. Next. Excuse me. So the problem that we're solving is having a way to securely have an identity provider notify a relying party that it's to log out a particular user and session for the identity at that identity provider. And it's called back channel because it's sent directly server to server rather than communicated through a front channel browser redirect channel like many kinds of logouts. Next. So the way this works is a message is sent to a defined endpoint at the relying party that supports back channel logout. It's sent as an HTTP post, and the format of the message is a JOT, which happens to also be a security event. Next. The claims in that JOT should be unsurprising to those familiar with ID tokens. You have an issuer, a subject, an audience, an issued at, a unique identifier, and then the new claim defined by the draft today, which is the events claim, which uses a particular value to say this is a back channel logout message. Next. So that's an example from the draft of what the claims in such a security event look like. Next. So things to take away from this use case. This event's very simple. It doesn't use any event-specific payload data. It just has an event identifier, being that URI that's defined. It just uses the normal top-level JOT claims to identify the subject of the event. The events claim is used per the spec to identify that this is a logout event. This does not use a special transport, such as the event transport being defined in the other draft. It's just an HTTP message. Next. So final thoughts. The security event format is very simple, just like JOT was very simple. It seems to work well for this use case. I think it's going to work well for some of the other use cases, such as the security events that were just described. I think being simple, it's likely to get adopted just like JOT appears to be. So I'm happy with this. And, you know, there may be other formats defined for other things, but that's outside the scope of what I'm talking about. Any questions?
Justin Richer, just one thing that I think is going to be a sort of an ongoing discussion in this group, and I know you and I have talked about it, Mike, and that's the placement of the issuer and subject inside all of these various tokens. Now, for the case of a logout like this, the issuer and subject pairing of an OpenID Connect identity, it does make sense because it's the IDP that's generating this logout message, but I would say, personally, I think that we need to be very careful to classify that as a very specific optimization for a very specific use case, because in other circumstances, we're going to have messages from either RPs or third-party logging providers or something like that, wherein the subject is not actually in the namespace of the issuer of the security event. It's in somebody else's namespace. So there will be another level of issuers, and I'm very afraid of us getting those things mixed up with each other and making them look like messages that they're not. So I just want to raise that. I don't think we have time to, you know, debate that here, but I want to raise that as an issue to the group and something that we have to decide what we want to do with this.
We're actually
Sure,
quite
I
ahead
acknowledge.
of time.
Oh, go ahead.
We're actually quite ahead of time, so we do have time to discuss.
No, trust me, no.
Okay.
I acknowledge that there's certainly going to be events with more complicated relationships that have to be expressed in the data structure. This was a simple bilateral, and it works well already according to people who've looked at it. But yes, there will be more complicated events with different representations, and the spec allows that. Thank you.
Okay, which leaves us with Phil and more.
Tony.
Yeah.
I was going to yield the first part on SCIM to Tony for a few minutes to talk about SCIM events. Microsoft's been doing some thinking there.
Yeah. So SCIM is great for a master directory situation. SCIM does not work well for multi-master directory synchronizations. And so we've been exploring using a way to do directory synchronization with events and feeds. And so, you know, we've got some prototypes working and stuff of how we wind up using the ID events to allow multi-directory synchronization to go on. You know, they put out the events into feeds, and you can pull from the feeds and take it from there, and you can pick the events that you want to be interested in or you want to apply to your directory. And so this is probably some work that may have been able to be done in SCIM, but now SCIM is shut down. You know, we looked for another way to actually do this, and this one actually works very well. We do not use the sets. Okay, so that's one thing that we would definitely like to see changed is right now the specs actually say that you wind up using the JWT, and we're not using that. We have other things that we put into the as far as events, different formats of events, and JWTs don't actually fit this particular case. So, you know, relaxation of what actually goes in there may help us, you know, get some things done. Okay.
Thanks, Tony. And the SCIM working group had been talking about some cases for many years. Some of them were high-level events, which you'll see repeated in what Marius said in the risk working group. SCIM had said, well, if from a provisioning perspective, a password was reset or an account was locked, we had a similar set of events. So one of the things I think we'll be thinking about going forward is, do we have some reconciliation of events, or is what the SCIM working group, if they want to assert a separate set of events and the risk working group sets it, and even though there's overlapping, is that a bad problem? For me, on the set side of things, I'm looking at it going, does that mean an issue in common? Does that mean some advice that we can lay out on the core spec that helps these other working groups decide what they want to do? If it hasn't been said, I think one of the, when this work started, it was because I noticed that all these working groups were working on a very similar problem, and I thought, well, geez, maybe we could use JOTs and bring them all together and at least have common libraries, some common interoperability. The question is how much is in common and how much independent. So I'll use terminology like profiling spec. So what I mean is a spec like the risk working group would write their spec. They define an event for risk that leverages the set token spec. So they get into the specifics of what their events mean. So a lot of the times when we're talking about set, it's the core spec that everybody's building off of. It doesn't necessarily have real events right now. Editorially, one of the challenges you'll see in the document is a bunch of made up events. Those aren't actually real events. They're just what they might look like if those groups went forward. So let's go ahead. So there are two drafts. One is slightly more mature than the other. You'll see the set token has gone through 6 revisions, and it's a profile itself of RFC 7519. We have a couple things that we're still talking about, some good ideas to optimize, and I'll mention that on a later slide. Distribution is only at revision 1, and we are still trying to sort out what are the real distribution problems, and even harder is how do we manage the pub-sub relationship. So we've kind of defined 2 issues in distribution. It may cause us to split this draft up into 2 separate specs. One is the control plane. How do I manage, as the subscriber, how do I tell a publisher I'm interested in a series of events? How do I exchange all the configuration keys? I want a signed event, here's my public key. Or I want an encrypted event, here's my public key, so you can encrypt the event. What's your public key so that I can validate that it was sent by you? If the endpoints are protected by OAuth, we have to have some management of tokens and all of that. So there's a fair amount of logistics to just get these connections working securely. So the control plane allows a client or even a publisher administrator to manage those subscriptions and also check the status of subscription. If I've subscribed to Google to get a bunch of events and I'm kind of normally getting 1,000 events an hour and I've not gotten anything for the last couple hours, is it because there's been no events, or is it because there's a failure condition because a key rollover occurred and guess what, we're not configured correctly? So there's some sort of DevOps anticipation requirements in the control plane. And the data plane is really what we most often think about is how do I deliver the event? So the draft right now specifies a simple HTTP post over TLS. The only thing that is complex about it is that we require the receiver before acknowledging receipt by sending it back an accepted response, it should at least check that the event was valid so that the publisher can assume the event was delivered. If it's just a post and they get an accepted immediately and the subscriber wasn't able to parse it or wasn't able to sort out, it just got gobbledygook. We want it to actually say, I couldn't parse the event. So that's as complex as we want to make that. That profile is there. There has been discussion about other modes of delivery through secure messaging from mobile apps, HTTP2 web push. There are other models, and from there I kind of say, okay, no problem. Let's not get crazy, but maybe if you do it, we should make you go through some criteria for why you're doing it. What are the security issues you should consider? And how would a client understand how you choose to distribute that event? Ideally, we'd like to keep it simple to one method, but that might not be real. Kathleen.
So now I see why you had some of the other, why you had a different transport listed on your notes. I don't think that one meets your needs, the taxi one. I'm wondering, I haven't looked at draft hunt idea event distribution, but I'm also wondering, you know, we're in an early stage, so let's compare what options are there. In Mile, there's an XMPP grid draft that has pub sub capabilities. It's in use by at least 10 vendors now. I don't know the current number, but the author is like right here.
What was that called? Sorry.
XMPP grid.
Oh, okay.
So
I was wondering about that.
It does what's described here. It's been deployed. So more than 10 vendors. I think it efficiently meets the goals you've described so far, but maybe I'll learn more once I read.
Does that add the bidirectional capability then, given it's XMPP? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that would sound very, I was wondering about that because the risk community's been talking about a bidirectional, bilateral relationship with the pub sub, and we were saying, would that be two separate subscriptions going each way, or would it be a bilateral communication path?
Yeah, not only that, but it can support all different data formats for the, you know, what you're exchanging. So since XMPP grid, XMPP can do that anyway, right?
Yeah.
So putting Nancy on the spot, but.
No, I think this is great. I mean, it's sort of, this is the first meeting and we want to gather what are all the issues and what can we reuse and get effective. I mean, the one thing that's driving us is move quickly. People want to implement stuff now. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So this is Nancy, just to answer some of the questions. And we can take it offline because I'm sure it'll be longer. So there is bilateralness. There's the question of from the control plane and security aspects. We need to clarify on what that bilateralness means. Typically, whether it's XMPP or the other ones, whether it's AMQP and you talk about queues versus XMPP, it talks about topics, right? It's usually you have some entities sharing that particular context, queue or topic. So anyway, just need to get clarity on what you mean by the bilateralness, but it should be there. Flexibility on defining the types of tokens.
Shared. One example, I think Mike sort of example didn't complete it, but one simple example is an identity provider, an open ID provider issuing a logout token to the relying party website is one direction, but often people have cases saying, I want to initiate the login at the retail site and we want to let the OP know. So in effect, the initiation could occur at either end. And then risk sort of talks about the same thing, risk events. We can see risky activity going on the commercial website and we want to let the IDP know there's a problem.
I got it because I just remembered that working group last call will start on that draft soon. So if people from this group want to just jump on the mile list with some reviews of it, that would be really helpful just to make sure if you do go ahead with it that you caught anything you needed to catch. Thanks.
Cool.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD.
Let's go to the next slide. So Mike actually did a good job of highlighting all these. We're just reusing all the JOT attributes. There are some things to sort out about things like issued at. There can be cases where the time at which the event is published is not necessarily the time the event actually occurred. So we may need language on that. Andy Nash a couple of weeks ago brought up a case that they do some analysis and discover a week later there was a problem in the expected occurrence of the event. It was like a week ago, but I'm issuing you the report now. So right now we only have one attribute. There can also be delta differences just simply because you have a distributed architecture. The component that detected the state change or the issue is not necessarily the one that published the event to its subscriber, and there might be a minute lag even, so we have to sort that out. Events was the attribute Mike already mentioned. That's how you indicate what type of event is being there. It also might give it a hint as to what amount of payload is there. Justin's made a proposal to the change the way the draft is written that makes it even simpler. Transaction, we noticed that there are a lot of cases where we might express the same event in 2 or 3 different ways because the subscriber, for example, might not understand what suspicious activity means. And Marius brought up the case, a lot of times they just say, look, cancel the sessions. Just don't worry about the reason why. Since you don't understand the reasons why and can't consume that, we'll just send you a session revocation. There are cases then when you want to go back and say, were all these events actually stemming from the same occurrence? So if I issued 3 different representations of an event, transaction could be used to say this was actually stemming from the same thing, even though it's expressed multiple ways. The event objects, the discussion earlier, which was if I need to pass an issuer for the subject as opposed to the issuer for the event, you would use a payload for that. You might have just other data, like in password resets, you might be keeping track of how many times does the user reset the account as additional data. So in a lot of cases, the event type, the subject, sends you a lot of information. You don't need anything more. But the reality might be, okay, this is now the 5th time that this has occurred, and so I'm letting you know. So there are cases where we want to send some additional data. Of course, one of the reasons we wanted to reuse JOT is it gave us the ability to sign and encrypt events, which gives us some flexibility. Maybe it's a good thing or not a good thing, but the idea that when people were saying, I wanted to send it out over iMessage, we knew the thing could be self-contained and encrypted if that's what we want to do. So the requirement to have a bulletproof transport, we're less dependent on it there. Go ahead, next. So this is Mike's example of a logout, but here I show payload. So there's a separate issuer in the session in addition. Sorry, you probably didn't hear that as I walked away from the mic. There's a separate issuer and SID. So the idea would be that the issuer here is the issuer of the subject up above, and the publisher of the event is serverexample.com. It was not the server that issued the identity. So The optimization we're talking about is moving this JSON object to be a subject.
Be careful.
Right. The optimization.
You can pull it up and hold it in your hand.
Do you want me to come point Phil while you're?
Yeah. So the optimization is to take this JSON object after that URL and move it into the events attribute as a sub-object of up there so that it's all self-contained. And then if you have no data, would you just put null or would you put empty brace brackets? We're just coming down to just empty brackets would be fine. And it's short and it's easier for faster parsing. So that's one change to the current draft. Next. So the delivery side is to contain an HTTPS post, some call it a web callback. We've talked about delivering multiple messages or one. So far the testing is saying don't bother with batching, just do one at a time. Maintain your connection pooling and you'll be good. All you do when we start doing multi-messages, we get into a lot more complex signaling, so we want to keep it simple. There's still discussion on that, but that seems to be settling down based on some of the testing. As I mentioned earlier, HTTP status 202 is used to confirm receipt. So when you issue that receipt, what you're saying to the publisher is, I got it. Now, whether you actually test or not is your business, but you're letting the publisher give up. So that's one of the conditions we're setting, saying we're not going to get as sophisticated as that. There's no callback or ACK message. It's if you didn't get the message or weren't able to parse it, you should throw an error. So we do define a bunch of HTTP status 400 errors that are really more often than not relating to JOT parsing issues that occur. You got the wrong key, the signature wasn't valid, and things like that. Next slide. So in thinking about the broader scope, I'm not happy with this slide yet. It was something I added late. We are trying to define what does it mean to have a feed of events. Is it a category of events? I'm subscribing to get a series of events from a publisher and I need an endpoint to deliver them to. So what is the relationship to? This is all building towards a data model for the control plane and how to deal with this. So given there might be, I've only listed 4, there might be many different events that could be generated, different formats. I could create feeds. So the example I sort of chose was I might have an OpenID provider that wants to issue logout events, and how would it group those logout events of interest? Well, it might group those by audience. And the effect of the audience might be that everybody within a single sign-on domain carries the same audience. So I might have servers in Hong Kong, servers in China, and they both might choose to subscribe to the single sign-out feed for Asia for this customer. So the idea was a many-to-one relationship between feeds and subscriptions. For various reasons, we're also talking about changing some of the terminology. So this is up in the air, not very mature. Have I missed something from our earlier discussion, Marius? Anyway, let's go on. Oh, risk adds another concept of you have a feed, define a logical feed between 2 entities. Let's say it's Oracle and Google. When we first set that up, there's no users in that feed. There's no subjects that are going to come across. But over time, through these explicit or implicit connections, Google will let us know that says this user, Phil Hunt, is using our services, so we'd like to get security events about Phil Hunt. And they would register and say, Phil Hunt is to be added to this feed, or Phil Hunt is to be removed from this feed, and that would be part of the control plane. So there's the notion of what are the event formats you're issuing, and then against what population of subjects or resources that those are being generated against. Next slide. So what's new here? So we were talking today or this morning that maybe what I was calling a subscription is really kind of a connection path. This is where I'm going to physically deliver a series of events to a specific web endpoint over a specific protocol, be it HTTP or XMPP or something like that. And how do I do that? What do I need to do to construct the JOT correctly for that subscriber, all the management information that goes with it. So that's what's in the definition for subscription. And for any feed, there can be many subscriptions. Next slide. I put in a state diagram, and I actually was interested. I was already working on it when Kathleen, I don't know if it was you or Stephen, raised the netconf issue. There's a lot of parallels. So while we felt we were very different in our stack, we were using JOT and using other things, I thought there was a lot to be learned from it. One of the things they had I thought that was interesting was a state diagram. So you can have a subscription, and that subscription can actually be in multiple states. It can be on, it can be off, it can be failed. What does it mean in each of those states? We have a state when you create a subscription called verify. And what that allows is for a special event to be sent called a verification event, which is simply, is this connection working and can they parse my events? And if the verification is good, then we're set to go. I saw in some other specs it was also a useful way to prevent a denial of service attack where somebody fraudulently tries to set up a subscription just to annoy someone else with a lot of data. So if the endpoint you get is actually doesn't know how to parse it or isn't a real endpoint, you'd quickly know this isn't going to work, and you're just doing, you go straight to fail and it's done. So that's where we're going. And then operationally, things change, keys rotate, connection network problems are going to exist, and we can anticipate that maybe after a bunch of trials to deliver an event, the publisher will flag that as failed. And so how does the subscriber know about it? They can check the control plane, the SCIM interface, and get the current subscription status. So next slide. One of the ways to do that is to do a SCIM get on the subscription. And you can see this down here. This sort of describes everything that's in the subscription. I have to apologize, substatus is wrong. It would be verify or on, or one of those. Pending was from an earlier version, so that's wrong. But that would actually, for most ongoing queries, when you're checking the status of the subscription, you would be looking to see that it's on normally. And then on the next slide, if I want to pause it because I'm doing something with my endpoint, I have to reboot the cluster or do something, I can ask the publisher to pause the subscription. Next slide. So down here, the subscriber can do a simple put, and he changes the value of substatus to paused. And that tells the publisher to hold on to events for as long as you can. One of the things we're talking about is what's the publisher's ability to store events or queue them up. If it's a high rate of events, it might be completely unrealistic beyond a few milliseconds. Other ones where it's 100 events a day, it could probably hold it for days. That's something that a publisher and subscriber would have to work out. This can also be done with a SCIM patch command. The reason I decided to show you put was that there are lots of libraries out there, not all of them implement patch, but put was a mandatory requirement. Next slide. So the verify, I mentioned this earlier, we can probably go on, but it's just basically the ping command that says, can you read this thing? It's not actually a real event, so we're specifying the one standard event, which is a verify event, and it just simply says, does the connection work, and can you read it and parse it? Next slide. There's the verification token, which is the way we confirm it was we send it some unique identifier, and if they can return it back to us in the response, that confirms to the publisher that they were able to actually parse the event. And that's actually the only time we respond in the HTTP post delivery method with an actual value back. Next slide. So this was the format that Justin proposed, that we just put the payload as part of the events attribute as a sub-object. So I've got it up there. That seems very reasonable, and from my perspective, a duh thing. So Tony raised the issue on distribution before the meeting, so it went on to the slide deck. We've had other things about, is the subscription model good? But one of the ones Tony said is, why arbitrarily limit this to JOTs? Maybe we can use the control plane to manage other relationships and other protocols and other formats. And there'll be some reworking, but I don't see why not. Though I come back to that the chartered objective is to make sure we can deliver a JOT correctly. But I don't see any reason why we should shut it down. So be interested in comments on that one. Yeah, so, and also Kathleen's comments on taxi and sticks are well advised. So that's it.
So any questions or comments about this presentation? Things that are generic to the working group will delay until for a few more minutes.
Should I clarify my comments? Was it clear enough what I asked on six taxi?
I understood, but maybe the wider audience.
Yeah, because we had a little conversation. So Sticks is huge, and it's about indicators of compromise and events and security-related incidents. Very, very large. So that might wind up using something like this. Taxi is what they call their transport. And in my opinion, it's way too bloated for what you're looking, especially with the description of what you were looking for in your requirements. And the reason I say that is that Taxi supports multiple protocols. So you need a broker to broker which protocol you're going to connect with, whether it's HTTP, XMPP, or some other transport. So, and what I've heard, and I keep hearing, is that it doesn't work, right? No surprise. That's a huge interoperability challenge to overcome when you have that type of complexity built in. So simpler is always better if you're trying to get this done in a simple way and meet the needs.
Yeah.
So those are just some of my opinions, not as an AD, as a contributor on the Sticks and Taxi. But yeah, you wouldn't want to bake your stuff into Sticks because it's big enough. And yeah, I mean, they can use each other, but not be the same, I don't think.
Yes, and I agree, and I totally worry about the same thing happening here, and I don't want that to happen. So I think while I'm trying to remain neutral, I might be applying pressure in that regard.
So this has been KDuck, and maybe I just missed this when you were talking about it, but at least on the slides for the verification, is that literally just ensuring that the connection works properly? That's not doing anything about confirming that, you know, if somebody is claiming that they have a user with this email address, that, you know, they actually have that email address or anything like that?
Yeah, it's really verifying that the connection works and that the stated in you know, if we're using JWE or JWS, that those were validating correctly.
Sure.
Doesn't necessarily verify that the publisher is knowledgeable or intelligent or
Right.
authoritative.
That's sort of remaining work.
Yeah.
And we have one from Miteco.
Hi, William.
William.
Dennis. Just on Justin's proposal, it certainly looks pretty reasonable to me to embed the attributes inside the payload. Is that something that we're going to vote on, or are we just accepting that change?
I don't mind voting on that. We actually had 3 alternatives for, well, one, following the format in general. The real question is, when there is no payload, what should go after?
Right.
Should it be the event URI : null? Should it be event URI :
Yeah.
true, or an empty set of brackets? And I prefer the last one. The first one, some people thought when they read it, that's saying I'm not asserting that
Right.
event because it's null. True is valid, but a lot of people who are writing code might be lazy and they're always expecting a JSON object. So that, then we came back to, why don't we just assert an empty object? And I'm saying I have no payload and it's less characters. So that's, I kind of thought.
I'm
that's
inclined to
the-
agree.
What do you think? Lynn?
I'm inclined to agree. Is this something that, how are we going to like just, I guess, like solve this problem? Are we going to vote on it or just do that?
John Bradley Ping. So while I'm personally in favor of the empty object, I think that we're probably new enough, and this hasn't actually been discussed on the group mailing list, that we may actually want to make sure that the document has been adopted as a working group document and people read it before we necessarily start making changes. But I happen to be in favor of the empty object.
Hopefully in the other order.
My
First
thought,
read it,
and,
then adopt.
my thought, and maybe you could advise me best thing, is I was thinking as an individual contribution right now, I think seems to me to be fairly obvious, and I would do one more vision and then you can sort of nominate that
Oh, yeah,
for
sure. Go ahead.
adoption.
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah,
Yep.
definitely.
I was just going to suggest exactly that, make the change, and
Yeah.
if we change it later, we change it later. But
I was
just run with it.
Yeah, I was looking for informal feedback from people in the room here to say, "Oh, don't do that. That's really bad." And I haven't heard that, so I'm happy to put it forward.
Bob Moskowitz, HT Consulting. It's coming to near the end of your time slot, so I decided to come up now and provide my.
Bob, I know what you're going to say, and there's room for it. There's time for it, but
Okay,
in a couple of
good.
minutes.
As long as there's time for it, I will wait
Yeah,
till you get
sure.
to that time.
Okay.
Okay.
John, again, just one clarification. There were two sort of issues that were floating around. One was whether or not the subject should be inside of the object, and whether or not everything should, or whether or not claims in general should be inside the object. I'm assuming that we're only talking about creating the object, but not necessarily enforcing that the subject must always be in there, because if that was the case, then other people would be up at the mic or at your throat.
My read of
One
the
of the two.
situation is that there are some legacy or backwards compatibility reasoning to keep the subject where
So-
it is at the top level.
So we're only agreeing to create the object.
The rest of the
at
text
this
I'm not
point.
talking about
Okay.
changing. Yeah. But anybody who has an issue should reopen it on the list. I'm still open on it.
William says that he agrees with John's assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
So a couple of notes from the chair. The next milestone for this group is to adopt drafts, and all the drafts that were presented here are still candidate drafts, are not working group drafts. And I'm not going to take a hum now because not enough people in the room who are not authors have read the draft. So we'll give you more time to read the drafts, and then we'll make a call for adoption on the mailing list. But that requires that people actually read the draft. So please do so. And we want to have drafts adopted before Chicago, but doing it earlier is better than doing it right before Chicago. Second thing, there's technical discussions should happen on the list. I'm sure there have been a lot of technical discussions in the last 2-3 weeks since I've become subscribed to the mailing list, and there has been nothing. So the discussions are happening somewhere else. Please move them to the list. The third thing is that some people approached me during this week and said, this shouldn't be a working group. This work shouldn't be done. It's duplicating some other things. And now is the time for you to come to the mic.
I don't at all have a problem with this work being done. I think it's great work for identity security events. This is not IETF security events. This is wonderful work on identity security events, which needs to be done. And so to call them the IETF security events, and for the outside world looking at it, is confusion relating. With inside your organization, you know indeed what you're talking about, which is great. But for other people looking at it, it's like, what is going on here? And so if there can be maybe a little clarity, it's a meta point on it. That's the first thing that I have to say as an outsider, though who's done a lot of other identity work. The other thing is that it'd be really nice to see this in terms of data modeling of your events, so that there may be a broader context of adoption when people look at these for, say, maybe small end devices where they're looking at how to deal with this. I don't know yet. I haven't looked into it, but you're aware that in the IoT space, there are some major issues in terms of identity holes and other things. And if there's anything which can be used to leverage in that direction, it could be of interest. I don't know. I haven't delved down that direction yet, but it's one that intrigues me personally. And if I would have like data models for what you're doing here, I can see how I can apply it in that world. So those are two requests I have. One's a meta point in terms of your naming, and the second one is in terms of data modeling so that we can see if its applicability in other areas. Thank you.
I'm wondering if this is just a naming problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, just for the name of the group. So, because I didn't read into any of that when I looked at all of this as an AD, right? When the IESG, when we were reviewing it, because we focus on the charter and the work, and the names eventually go away anyway.
Yeah, Ron Schiff, I'm hearing a lot of potential privacy issues. Some more subtle, like transaction IDs, revealing information between applications. Some less subtle, like the implicit, whatever it was called in the risk presentation, were the mere fact that I'm using a Gmail address as a recovery email means that that Google gets to find out about basically everything I'm using. So I'm not quite sure how to handle it. One possibility would be to start with a use case document, which normally I don't like, but it will address the privacy issues. Somehow there may be other ways to deal with it. Thank you.
So I was going to wait till the technical line was done, but people are leaving the room. So I would like more volunteers for chairs. I am supposed to talk to at least one person, but Yoav has been kind enough to be an acting chair, and so thank you very much. But please send a message to Stephen and myself, because we work on these things together, about, you know, if you'd like to be a chair of this group.
Ben Kadek, sort of just following on a little bit off the previous comment, that, you know, yes, this is potentially worth doing, but, you know, identity and identity events are not, you know, there's not a monopoly for them in the web and the OAuth world. There's certainly other things that you might be interested in this are perhaps not even in the room.
Justin, one of the things that was in the room but was told we didn't have time for it on the schedule. One of the driving use cases that started out this working group is actually work that we've been doing in the OpenID Foundation's HEART working group, and that's all about notification and auditability of consent transactions. So when a user says, yes, I'm allowing this medical record to go to this provider or something like that, providing a way to ship that kind of information. And one of the things that happened when we first founded this working group, that was due to a realization that the stuff that we were working on and the stuff that Risk was working on, there was this common thread that we wanted to start pulling at. So there's a lot more than just identity transaction events. There's a lot more than just even kind of the OAuth OpenID Connect security events going on here that could use this kind of same core mechanism. And I think that we should definitely pursue that in sort of the broader case.
I agree with that comment, and I just wanted to add on the topic of kind of why we're doing this. You know, one of the reasons is that you know, JOT was obviously standardized in the IETF, and this is a profile of JOT that describes how they can use with security events. And you know, building on that comment from Justin, is that we wanted to make sure that there was kind of one way to do this, that all these different groups could use, and avoid having sort of competing ways. And when we first looked at the problem, there was sort of some messy hacks using JOT to sort of avoid like accidental misprocessing one type of JOT as a different type of JOT. And so we sort of felt like it would also be safer and more secure to have kind of this one representation of an event to make the processing easier. So I'm personally in favor of doing this work in the IETF if we can.
Okay, any more? Good. So just make sure that blue sheets get back to me and that you've signed them. And hope we'll see you all in Chicago.